This 25-minute documentary follows a 2-ton Washington State Malbec fermentation for 3 weeks through fermentation. There's 5 short video clips with discussions as the ferment progresses. The footage for the first 3-minute segment was taken 24 hours after the grapes were crushed. Then I didn't really know what was going to happen, but I had a clue that I chose to ignore. I smelled a hint of VA, but I ignored it. I didn't really yet know that it was going to be a wild thing. One way or the other, it was a beautiful fermentation, and it ended well, but it began rather dramatically. So the theme here is the need for the winemaker to remain flexible. The first video of this year was checking wine sugars and pH. That is when the Malbec fermentation actually began, but you may choose to watch it later if you have not already. I hope you learned something here. I certainly did. I do every time. So those pH numbers and the Brix numbers are good enough for me to consider doing an indigenous fermentation on these 2 fermenters, and that means not adding yeast. My own personal rule on that is if the grapes are in really good condition and the numbers are good that we just checked today, then I really like doing a natural fermentation. They make the best wines. But if the pH is too high, if the grapes have been hanging out there too long, if they ripen too early, I'll add yeast, and a commercial yeast, and there's so many good yeasts to try. It's all fun, but this is a good chance for me to do a spontaneous, feral, indigenous, natural, whatever you want to call it, fermentation. When this Malbec showed up yesterday, it was beautiful. The stems were kind of purple and lignified. The seeds were crunchy. The grapes were in good condition. They didn't smell moldy. There wasn't much refuse. Very little leaves in the grapes. They tasted vibrant. In other words, if the grapes hang on the vine too long, they get kind of tired. Yes, the sugar might go up a little bit more, the pH goes way up, and what happens is the phenols start to polymerize. In other words, they get set in place. So whatever tannic structure you've got there, whatever anthocyanins, it's not really going to change. What I want, ideally, is to get grapes when they're in their monomeric state, so that the phenols are still they're still available to change, and that occurs throughout the fermentation and into the bottle. So since the phenolics are monomeric and susceptible to change, they can evolve into the bottle, into a complex tasting wine that has more than one taste to it. So many wines are single dimensional. If the grapes have been hanging on the vine a long time, and it tends to produce higher pH, flat, single dimensional wines that are good, but I want more. I want bouquet. I want fruit. I want a finish that stays with you for a long time. Right? So, and I get that with a natural fermentation, so this is a good opportunity for me to do that, because these grapes were in really good shape. I'm excited about this particular batch of Malbec. I'm Mark Stanley, author of Creating World-Class Red Wine, available on Amazon and Kindle in print form. In one of my other videos I mentioned the need for a winemaker to be flexible, to be like a chameleon. On Sunday, I got 2 tons of Malbec grapes, and they were beautiful, 24 Brix, 3.57 pH. Stems were gorgeous purple color, fully lignified. The seeds were crunchy. And so I'm very pleased. But the next day, when I came back to take the winemaking sugars and pH video that you can look at too, I noticed that the 24 hours after we crushed it, the grapes were at 54, 7 degrees Fahrenheit and 14 degrees Celsius. And I noticed that it just seemed like it was starting to ferment. Well, it's a very low temperature for a red wine fermentation to happen. It's never happened to me before. This is the most unusual fermentation I've ever had. So I've worked with this Malbec before from the same vineyard block, and I've never had it start to ferment at that low of a temperature. But I didn't want to believe it. It was sort of, this is what I'm talking about, flexibility and chameleon-like. There's one thing, there's the philosophy, there's the usual program. For me, it would be maybe a 3-day cold soak in the 50s, turn the heater on, it starts to ferment naturally for a couple of days, and then inoculate with a yeast, or let it go natural. That would be what I usually would do. And so that's the philosophy. It's like up here in gilded brackets, like a professor that teaches about how to make wine, but never does it. That's the idea. But here's the reality. The next day, so 48 hours after I crushed, I came back and it was 57 degrees, or 56 degrees. It had gone down a degree in temperature, but it was fermenting. Immediately I smelled volatile acidity, VA, which is, that's what any cap smells like when it needs to be punched down. It's not a stink. It's kind of like a precursor to vinegar smell. And so I knew it needed to be pressed down, so I tried to press it down, and I couldn't get enough juice up to wet the cap. I had to punch all the way through on day 2 at 56 degrees. So then I go, well, excuse me, what do I do? I turn the heat on. If this fermentation wants to ferment, we must let it do it. I can't force it to do what I want it to do necessarily. I don't want to force a fermentation anyway. So, this is a ferment that's saying, maybe I don't feel like doing cold soak. Okay, you don't have to do cold soak. You can just start fermenting. So I turned the heat on, and today is day 5. The temperature is at 64 degrees, and the brix has come down from 24 to 21. Voila. The color is showing some nice color for the 5th day. And so I'm going to play it like this. So I'm going to try to increase the heat. I want the fermentation to hit a peak temperature of 86 degrees Fahrenheit. I do not want to do in the 60s and 70s fermentation, Celsius, 22 to 24 degrees Celsius. I don't want to have that fermentation in that range. It tends to produce wines that taste fruit juice, like fruit juice instead of wine. And yes, in the old school American winemakers talk about low temperature fermentation as if it were a good thing, but really it's a jug wine technique. I want to hit 86 degrees, and at least into the 80s, and so I'm bringing the temperature up on this fermentation. So we have to be flexible. So I'm going to keep you posted, and I'll continue this video tomorrow. All right, it's day 6. The temperature of the ferment is now at 70 degrees, or 20.5 Celsius, and the brix is at 19. So it's come down 2 brix in one day at in between 64 degrees and 70. So the temperature should start to rise now. I don't mind having a long, slow fermentation, but I just prefer if it was a little warmer. So this fermentation is a candidate for me to consider, and I'm going to do in indigenous, spontaneous, natural, native, feral, as the Australians call it, fermentation, where I'm just going to let it go because the grapes were in good shape. They had the numbers were good. The grapes weren't too sweet. The pH wasn't too high. They weren't moldy. They looked good. They tasted really good. So that's when by my own playbook, that's what I would consider doing a natural fermentation. Otherwise, I'd add yeast. Last year, I got Syrah at 28 bricks and 3.82 pH. Well, that's over the top. So I used a yeast. I think I used D21, which is a high alcohol tolerance yeast. Of course, I reduced the sugars. Yeah, I did not leave it up there at 28 bricks. I reduced the sugars. I added tartaric acid, and I inoculated with yeast. Here, I'm not going to do any of those things. But yesterday, I did add some organic nutrient. And the one I happen to use because I can get it in a 1 kilo package is OWN organic wine nutrient that's produced or marketed out of Napa, California. There's also Fermate O, Nutristar.org. There's other products that are organic. And what that means is they don't have any diammonium phosphate in them. I don't use diammonium phosphate. Fermate K has diammonium phosphate. Superfood has diammonium phosphate in it. Both of those do, and others. The old school and the professors are still preaching the use of diammonium phosphate. What is it? It's food grade agricultural fertilizer. It's the same thing as it's lawn fertilizer. And so it's a very popular theme nowadays with the really quality wines in California, the best wines in California. A lot of winemakers are using the organic products that do not have DAP in them. What's in them? Well, a lot of yeast hulls, thiamine, which the yeast like a lot, and other nutrients. So that's what it's an expensive nutrient, but that's what I used. I feel that along with a lot of other winemakers, that diammonium phosphate is kind of like a shot in the arm for yeast. It's kind of like, as I mentioned in another video, using the analogy of sending a child off to school and letting her go to the junk store for breakfast. Well, I want the fermentation to be healthy and happy. I don't want to add too much nutrient, but I want it to be happy, and so I use an organic nutrient in a natural fermentation. If I were inoculating with yeast and I felt that the grapes had, let's say the YAN number, the yeast available nitrogen number, was good, I may only inoculate with yeast and use GoFirm, because the idea is just to give them just enough to where they're happy. You don't want to give them too much yeast nutrient. I mean, yes, the universities teach full nutrient programs. Well, how happy? There's the whole theory of stress and controlled stress. You get what I'm saying. The universities will preach a full nutrient program, like GoFirm, and then twice adding some nutrients. Well, it's not necessarily necessary. But wineries, get a yeast available nitrogen, a YAN number from the lab, and then they use that as a basic guideline as to how much nutrients they need. Also, how nutrient hungry is your yeast. I was assistant winemaker years ago, like my first week on the job, and it was kind of a coup d'etat for me because I encountered a Syrah vat, and I told the winemaker, I went and found the winemaker and said, I think this thing's going reductive. Sure enough, it was. So it was like, it was a good one for me, and we fixed it by adding nitrogen to that, and we actually added DAP, and because that's what he had, and Fermate K to that fermentation, and it fixed it right away. If you've ever smelled reductiveness, it's like a rotten egg. And that was a Syrah fermentation, and he was using the Syrah yeast. That's what it's called. It's an isolate from Hermitage, the Syrah. Good yeast, but it's nutrient hungry. So when you use a yeast, pay attention to what the nutrient needs of the yeast are, what the alcohol tolerance are. Those are really two important factors, especially if you're working with high bricks or high sugars fruit like I do a lot in Washington State. So I'll keep you posted on this fermentation tomorrow. We'll see how it goes. It's October 13th, day 7. The Malbec is now at 16 bricks, 77 degrees, that's about 24 degrees Celsius. And I checked the pH, it has risen a little bit at up to 3.58. Now that's checking just the juice. I didn't blend it this time, I checked just the juice. And so that's what we've got. So the fermentation is progressing nicely. It smells good. The temperature's finally getting up there at 16 bricks. A lot of times the peak temperature for a fermenter is when it's around 10, 8 to 10, and then it starts to drop off naturally in temperature. So it's highly likely that I will hit my target of 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And so today, I better get this show on the road here, because today they're showing up. We're going to crush 2.5 tons of Petit Verdot today. What is Petit Verdot? Petit Verdot. People always ask me, what is that? Well, it's a grape from Bordeaux. It's one of the lesser grapes from Bordeaux. I mean, left bank Bordeaux, Cabernet Sauvignon area, like let's say where Cabernet Sauvignon is queen. Very famous chateau and one of the 5 first growths. And I think Margaux has 75% Cabernet Sauvignon in the vineyard, 20% Merlot, I believe 3% Petit Verdot, and 2% Cabernet Franc. There's no Malbec in that vineyard, but there is Malbec in some of those surrounding vineyards. So those are the grapes that are used for the classic Bordeaux blend in different proportions depending on the chateau. But the Petit Verdot is a late ripener. It's the latest grape to ripen in Bordeaux. So sometimes, in a good year, the Petit Verdot is included in the blend, and in a less than stellar year, it may not be in the blend at all. They may sell it off in barrels. Right. Here in Washington State here, it ripens. Eastern Washington is hot. It's a dry desert scrubland. I mean, we're sourcing the Petit Verdot from Rattlesnake Hills AVA. I mean, I'm on the west side of the mountains. Look at the ferns here. There are no rattlesnakes here. Hallelujah. But it ripens here. In Bordeaux, if it doesn't ripen, they may still work with it, but they sell it off in barrels. Petit Verdot is a dark, tannic, acidic grape that's sort of simple, straightforward, but it's got an interesting dried Marionberry kind of characteristic, at least what I get out of Eastern Washington. But in Bordeaux, they'd sell the barrels off if they didn't like them. And the barrel trade in Bordeaux is huge. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of barrels get traded every year. 100 years ago, that's all there was barrel trade in Bordeaux. Meaning a winery like Margaux would produce the wine, and then they'd sell the barrels to a merchant called a négociant would blend and bottle the wines and then sell it with their own labels on it. Well, I think it was 1917, the Rothschild family bought Chateau Mouton. And in 1923, I think, Baron Philippe took possession, or went there to live. And I don't know if it was 1917 or 1923, but to give you a little bit insight on Baron Philippe's character, he said, when we got there was no running water, no power, and no telephones. And it was sublime. Well, maybe he was a little bit of a back to the land, or even back then. So it gives you a little bit insight on his character. So what he did was he set up a bottling facility on site. And so produced the wine there and bottled it and labeled it there. And that was a new thing in that era. So then he encouraged the other nearby chateau to do the same thing. So today, when you buy a bottle of French wine, if it says Mise en bouteille au Chateau on the front of the bottle, that's legal. That means the wine was made there, cellared there, bottled there, and labeled right on that property. It's legal. And I like to see that. If I purchase even at Trader Joe's, you get a little $12 Petit Bordeaux, and I look at it, if it says Mise en bouteille au Chateau on there, I consider that a benefit. I might go on the website and check out the little family website, and it might be a mom and pa winery that's way out in a not so prestigious area in Bordeaux, but they're proud of what they do, and I consider that a good thing when I go to buy a bottle of French wine. Okay, I'm rambling. Well, the fermentation is going along well. They're going to show up here at any minute, so I better shut the camera off, and we'll check in again on the Malbec fermentation tomorrow. Oh yeah, what am I going to do with the Petit Verdot? Well, the plan is the normal plan, and that is 3 days of cold soak, maybe a little bit of natural fermentation, but then I'm going to add a yeast. I bought a Nardis vintage yeast, which is kind of it's an Italian yeast that has a bit of Italian-esque character to it, and it's a country wine sort of a character, so I thought about blending the Petit Verdot, the Malbec, maybe some Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon to make a kind of a French country wine with an Italian yeast. So that's what I'm doing theoretically. But I had this idea. I was thinking about it. Why did the Malbec start fermenting so early? Well, the vineyard that we're getting this from is primarily a vineyard, but they do have a small winery that they contract out. They rent it out for a crush pad and some fermentation space, maybe even white fermentation space. The Malbec vineyard block is down below that, kind of off to the southeast. And I did have the idea that perhaps the yeast from all those fermentations, possibly some white wine fermentations that they've done in there, has transmigrated to the Malbec block, and maybe it's a white wine yeast, and that's why I got early fermentation, maybe. We'll see. The Petit Verdot is also next to the winery, next to the winery on the north side. So we'll see how the Petit Verdot behaves. It'll be interesting, yes. I'll check in again tomorrow. Here's the Petit Verdot. Let's see what it tastes like. Nice little small berries, some raisining, quite a bit of raisining. Bonjour, it's day 8 for the Malbec fermentation. It's made it up to 84 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. So I'm pleased. It's at 12 bricks right now, so it could gain another degree or 2 Fahrenheit, or even a whole degree centigrade. I don't know, but that'll be okay. So I'm very pleased. It's at 12 bricks right now. I also added a wee bit of organic wine nutrient today at 12 bricks, but I certainly wouldn't want to add any below that. I wouldn't want have any nutrients left over for any bacteria to feed on after the fermentation is over. So I add a little bit of nutrient today. So I'm very pleased with that fermentation. What's in the hydrometer here is the Petit Verdot. It's at 25.1, and it's at 3.68 pH. At 3.68, I'm going to need to add a little bit of tartaric acid, because during fermentation, the pH will go up by about 0.12, and then during malolactic fermentation, the pH will go up by about another 0.12 or 1.3. So we would end up theoretically at 3.92 pH, which is too high for me. And so I will add a little tartaric acid to the Petit Verdot today, just a small amount, to bring it down to so that the finished wine will end up at about 3.80. I will add it today or very early in the fermentation during cold soak because I want the acid to integrate well into the wine. The yeast will help metabolize the added acid into the wine. If grapes have their own natural acids, somehow the taste is smoother and more integrated in the wine, where if you add acid, it's always a little bit of an added acid taste. But that's why I prefer to add it early, so that, like I said, the yeast help metabolize it, it integrates well into the wine. Well, it's day 15, Malbec fermentation. The temperature is at 69.5 Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. The pH ended up at 3.66, which it's been an unusual fermentation. Remember, I predicted 3.72. I'm pleased. I'm happy with 3.66. Better acidity. Very happy with that. The fermentation fermented dry. In the glassware is a low-range specific gravity hydrometer that is reading 0.995. It's been temperature corrected. That's dry. So for all you naysayers that say, oh, natural fermentations have difficulty firming down to dryness, how many of your fermentations do you ever get down to 0.995? Not very many of mine do. Usually I'll hit 0.997 or 0.996. You know, we're in the minus 1.5 range. This is almost minus 2. So it's dry. Why? Do you remember the grapes were healthy? They were vibrant. The numbers, the pH and the sugars weren't too skewed. I added 2 small additions of organic nutrients. It's a beautiful fermentation, right? So now I'm parking the fermentation for 5 days because we're going to press it on next Saturday. It happens in a winery all the time. You wrap up the fermenters and they get parked for 1, 2, 3 days until you press them. This is 5 days. So technically, this is extended maceration, which is a technique. It's an old world technique, traditional technique, more often appropriate for a chateau-style winery where the winemaker, or it's her winery. She grew up there. They're her grapes. She knows them intuitively. So how does extended maceration, what's the process? There's different ways of doing it. But the artistic traditional process is the grapes are in the fermenter. The must is in the fermenter. It's fermented dry. It's done. But you cover it up and leave it in the fermenter for up to 3 weeks or so. And every day the winemaker tastes it. The wine becomes, you're looking at the chart. The wine becomes more and more tannic every day. So she tastes it. It's more tannic every day. And after maybe 2 weeks, all of a sudden, the tannins drop out and it tastes smooth. And she says, we're pressing today. They're all ready for it. Why? Because after that day, the tannins go up here. The chemistry behind that, the chemists still argue about that one. And I don't know how many studies have been done on it because there are no electronic devices, there are no mechanical devices that have ever been designed and built to detect those tannins. It's all about the human taste and the artistic sensitivity of the winemaker. Right. During the next 5 days, when I'm parking this, or during an extended maceration, what you want to do is handle the cap very carefully. So we're going to go back to a gentle handling of the cap. We already went through press down during cold soak, punch through during vigorous fermentation, and now once again we're going to handle the cap very delicately. It's got some phenolics in it that we don't want to upset, right? And we're going to add some oxygen. It's really important at this stage. Malolactic fermentation is already beginning, and ML insists upon a lot of oxygen right at first. So why would you do extended maceration? What's the whole point of it? Perfume, earthiness. It's appropriate for grape varieties that are destined for long aging. Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. And grapes, also the grapes that were grown on old vines. Young vine fruit, like third leaf fruit that's very young, it produces fruity wines. The grapes are adolescents, and so the wines are vibrant and brilliant. They can be really brilliant from third leaf vines, but as a winemaker, what I would do is endeavor to express the fruit. Period. Simple, fruity, fruit-forward wine for a young vine. Or if you have grape, you're working with grape varietal that its forte is fruit, like Cinsault, Gamay, Counoise. That's all it has. So that's when I would not use extended maceration. This was a great fermentation for us to do a video on because it was unusual and it worked out well. So if you have any comments, please leave comments. It really should be an open forum. If you disagree, back it up with something. I'm good with that. But let's make better wine, shall we?